Welcome back as we continue our special coverage from the United Nations here in New York. On Wednesday, the Palestinian flag will fly here at the UN, and both the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are scheduled to address the UN this week. But what about peace efforts? Recently, I talked with the UN's Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Nickolay Mladenov. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. As far as the United Nations is concerned, where is the peace process?
It's certainly not in a very good spot right now. I think it's fair to say that for quite some time now, the two parties have drifted apart substantially, both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So the absence of a peace process today is actually one of the factors that is contributing to the instability of the region, as well as to the increasing tensions on the ground. People see less political prospect for their future. Many of the Palestinians are disenchanted. They don't believe that there'll be a two-state solution increasingly. The Israeli public opinion has also drifted in a different direction. It's certainly not a good time, and I think that's precisely why we in the international community must focus on not just on sort of talking about resuming the peace process, but actually looking at what needs to change on the ground in terms of the policies of the two sides in order to make negotiations meaningful and possible again. This is where we are today. If we leave it as it is, I think very quickly the two-state solution will just drift away. This will continuously feed more instability, more anger in the street, and ultimately it will get entangled into the broader conflicts of the Middle East, which is something that I think we all need to avoid right now.
Is there a blueprint in place right now that will act as a guide to move these negotiations forward?
It's difficult to call it a blueprint, but I think what the consensus opinion now is emerging among the key partners dealing with the peace process is that we must focus on three things. Firstly, we must focus on what's happening on the ground. There are certain policies that need to change. And here I refer to Israeli settlement policy, to other policies in the West Bank in particular, but not just there, also in Gaza, that need to change in order to make life for the Palestinians easier and better. Economic policies, some related to security, to institutions. This would create an environment in which the two parties could work better in a negotiation. The second factor is the region. We cannot pretend that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is somehow separated from everything else that is happening in the region. It affects the rest of the region. We saw that the violence in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Temple Mount compound recently reverberated across the Muslim world. But we also see that the religious radicalism in the entire Middle East is affecting people, also Israelis and Palestinians alike. So we need to find an appropriate formula for the region to support re-engagement in the negotiations. And one of the cornerstones of that is the Arab Peace Initiative of a few years ago. And thirdly, we need to look at what is it that the international community can do to reaffirm, restate its commitment to a two-state solution, but also come forward with proposals that support the parties in the negotiating process. I think right now we're in a situation where we need to really look at these three factors: the situation on the ground, the region, the role of the international community. And if we are able to orchestrate an engagement that is that recognizes the limitations and the constraints that the two parties have right now, we should be able to move them closer to a negotiated solution. But once we do that, of course, the impotence is really on the leadership.
You mentioned the Arab Initiative a moment ago.
Yeah.
That's the Arab League Initiative. That calls for the withdrawal of Israel to the 67 borders, some land swaps, security guarantees, etc., etc. Does that remain the plan? Is that the goal here?
Well, I think as far as the Arab partners in this process, the Arab League, this is the proposal that is still on the table. It provides an important contribution to a vision of how the situation in the region can be normalized in the future. Mutual recognition after a Palestinian state is established, mutually agreed borders, etc. That would normalize economic activity, and it would certainly normalize the security arrangements that should exist in a volatile region like the Middle East. I hope that there's an increasing understanding now in the entire region, both among Arabs and Israelis alike, that the threats that countries face of this rising tide of radicalism, of religious extremism, demands that there are shared security arrangements that are in everybody's interest. Of course, the cornerstone of the Arab Peace Initiative is that a Palestinian state emerges, that it is recognized by Israel, that a number of issues are resolved as the final status issues related to capital, to refugees, etc. And one cannot imagine a situation in which this issue will be overlooked or sort of sidelined because of other considerations. If one looks at the broader picture today, we have generation after generation of Palestinian refugees who are living in a number of countries outside of the West Bank and Gaza. These people continue to demand not just international attention, but assistance for their daily survival. They're a very powerful Palestinian constituency in terms of formulating policy, but they also risk at falling prey to this overall process of radicalization in the region. Now, if you add all of these things together, you see why, you see the logical necessity for countries to move forward on the peace process and to find how they can cooperate and work together for restoring law and order to the region.
The Palestinians will raise their flag here at the United Nations. As we just heard the Palestinian representative tell us, it's symbolic. But what does that mean?
It is symbolic, and it is part of a broader symbolism of hope for people on the ground.
Does it put pressure on Israel?
I think it does, but I think what is more important is that it actually provides hope to Palestinians. In the absence of a peace process, in the absence of movement forward on negotiations, given the realities of where we are in the region, people must see hope. And if there's one appeal that I sort of always keep putting forward to all sides, is like, do not underestimate the necessity of hope for public opinion and for people, both for Israelis and for Palestinians, because very easily in this situation things can get radicalized and come out of control. Over the last few months we've seen this really terrible terrorist attack in which a Palestinian baby was burned to death, and the parents also succumbed to their wounds later. This was a terrible terrorist attack, completely unnecessary. We've seen violence at the holy sites in Jerusalem. Now, all of this reflects tensions that exist in both societies. And if leadership is unable to provide and formulate the vision for the future, how the situation will be normalized, how the situation will look from 1 year, 2 years, 10 years down the line. People will lose hope, and once that happens, they can very easily fall prey to radical groups that have a very destructive agenda. Therefore, I think anything that can be done to keep that hope alive and to create the conditions under which the parties can move forward should be really the prime responsibility now for all of us. Okay.
Very quickly, the United States has been preoccupied with the fight against ISIL, or ISIS as it's sometimes called. The United States has also been preoccupied with the Iran nuclear deal. Now that the nuclear deal is over, are you hopeful that more attention will be paid to this particular issue? I mean, are you disappointed that the Obama administration has not made resolution of this dispute more of a priority?
I think what we've seen over the last few years in the region as a whole has really strained international policy thinking on how to deal with the challenges. And international approaches have varied. I think a few years ago there was a lot of excitement about what happened in the Arab Spring across the region. Sadly, that excitement was not followed by consistent international support for countries. The inability of the international community to resolve the conflict in Syria, continuing violence in Libya and elsewhere, the rise of ISIL, all of this has really strained the ability of the international community to deal with these issues at the same time. It has, in fact, perhaps taken off some of the spotlight from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think increasingly now there's an awareness that everything that happens in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has the ability to further fuel the violence in the region. And this was very much illustrated by reactions to what happened in the holy sites in Jerusalem just a couple of weeks ago. But similarly, everything that happens outside of the region has the ability to radicalize the situation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Therefore, I think sort of the lesson learned for all of us today is that you can no longer consider that this conflict is somehow isolated from everything else that is happening around it, and it would really be in the interest of everyone if we refocus attention back to the situation.